Good evening. My name is Watson, and I'm the Atlantic publicist at Nimbus Publishing. On behalf of all my colleagues, I'd like to welcome you to today's book launch for the very first graphic novel that Nimbus has ever published, Dusty Dreams and Troubled Waters, a story of HMCS Sackville and the Battle of the Atlantic. No matter where you're visiting from today, I want to acknowledge the land that Nimbus and its employees occupy. We are located on unceded and unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory in Mi'kma'ki. We are settlers, grateful guests. We acknowledge the privilege of taking up this space and invite you all to extend your gratitude to the Mi'kmaq people, to consider what it means to be an ally, and to never forget the story of the land you occupy. Live in gratitude and in community. I'm so thrilled to be here today to celebrate this incredible story of a farm boy from Winnipeg who comes to Nova Scotia and serves aboard HMCS Sackville during the years-long Battle of the Atlantic. The book itself is an amazing way for young people and people of all ages to learn about an important part of Canadian history. As some of you may know, the story of the book's creation was one of tragic loss. Its illustrator, the renowned Richard Rudnicki, passed away suddenly in 2019 when the book was close to completion. Ultimately, his wife, the also renowned artist Susan Tooke, took on the challenging task of finishing the illustrations. I'm so glad that she did, and that we all have the opportunity to enjoy this important book. And now I'd like to give a few quick thank yous. Thank you to my colleagues at Nimbus, from editorial to design to customer service to the warehouse staff, for your steadfast work, especially over such a difficult year, making books and bringing them to readers. Your work is important, and we are all so grateful. Thank you especially to the book's designer, the talented Jen Embry, and to its editor, the amazing Whitney Moran. Also, thank you to Naval Trust Life member Doug Thomas for agreeing to moderate tonight's launch. Thanks, Doug. To the Canada Council for the Arts and the Province of Nova Scotia, thank you for making our publishing program possible. And thank you to the readers. Without you, we couldn't do what we do. Thank you for supporting Atlantic Canadian books and publishers. And finally, thank you to the guests of honor, author Brian Bowman and illustrator Susan Tooke. Now let me introduce Brian, Susan, and Doug Thomas, who, as well as moderating this evening, was also the technical director of the book. If you have questions for any of these three, just type them into the comments section and they'll answer them when the main presentation is over. First off, Brian Bowman grew up in the Qu'Appelle Valley of southern Saskatchewan, where his family raised politics, grain, and cattle. His attempt at many vocations, including acting, informs a writing career for all media that evolved from advertising to journalism and editing. Still a Saskatchewan resident, he now writes mostly true stories drawn from Canadian history. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you.
Focusing on environmental issues, Susan Tooke has developed visual symbolism for life forms impacted by the elements and layered through time. While painting is the foundation of her studio work, she is also known for her work in media arts, including sound, video, and animation. A celebrated illustrator, her artwork for children's literature has resulted in multiple awards, including 4 Lillian Shepherd Memorial Awards. Welcome, Susan. And Doug Thomas joined the Royal Canadian Navy in September 1965 as an officer cadet at HMCS Venture in say it, Doug. Esquimalt, BC. I should have practiced. In subsequent years, he served at sea in destroyers and ashore in training establishments and headquarters in Halifax and Ottawa, in Portsmouth and London on exchange with the Royal Navy, and in Cambodia with the UN peacekeeping mission in 1992. After retirement from the Navy in 2000, he worked at the Maritime Warfare Center in Halifax as a civilian consultant, and from 2001 until 2019, he was executive director of the Canadian Naval Memorial Trust, which owns and operates the last corvette, HMCS Sackville, Canada's naval memorial. Welcome, Brian, Susan, and Doug. And now I'll turn the evening over to Doug, and we'll begin.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Kate. I'm
It's a very interesting project that we've been embarked on for the last number of years. Certainly, I had no idea what a graphic novel was until the last number of years. Now you can't go into a large bookstore like Chapters without finding many, many shelves of graphic novels, and they're very popular with young people. And I think a lot of adults, certainly adults my age, had the idea that these were comic books, but they're anything but. They're really serious literature. And in the case of this book, beautifully illustrated by Richard Rudnicki, and as you've heard, Susan, his wife, took over to help finish the book. I'd like to ask Brian a few questions about actually developing the book.
Mm-hmm.
Brian, could you tell me how you and Richard Rudnicki came to collaborate on Dusty Dreams?
Sure. Richard was illustrating the cover of my father's self-published book on his naval experience during the war. And in the process, discovered that I was acting as editor. He had started work on a graphic novel about the Sackville and asked if I would look at it to assess it, which I did do, and decided that it had merit, but it needed some changes. And so consequently, I took over as writer, and he agreed to illustrate, and the rest is history, I guess. It's in describing what a graphic novel is, I've had it described to me by another graphic novelist as it's a movie you hold in your hands. And I think that's apropos. It really is. That exactly is what it is. It's images are considered to be worth 1,000 words. If you look at the word count in a graphic novel, you'll find that it is about a 10-to-1 ratio. Image exceeds the text by a great deal, but it conveys so much information, and Richard has been able to do that. Now, this scene that you're looking at here is a prairie scene. You can see the flat prairie. You can see a truck in the bottom panel. This illustrates the 1930s when the novel really begins. Times were very hard out here, and farms were closing. People were moving away. It was a desperate time, and people were looking for something to relieve that, as they were elsewhere in the planet. So this is a very rough illustration. The illustration that follows it is one that's more rendered, and that's how the process starts with film, and that's how it works with this. You go with a rough storyboard with film, and then you render a more complete storyboard later, which then instructs the film crew and the production crew as to how to complete the project. And it's exactly the same with this. I developed a script for this with instructions for the visuals, and I left it open-ended because you've got to let the artist interpret the scene. It's an involved process, takes a long time, but look at the result. This is a very skillfully rendered image that you're looking at here, and I think it's evocative. So how many words do you need to put into that scene? Really, there might be a few panels, and they're in there actually elsewhere in the book, but it just carries the story through. Text is a minimal in this sort of a thing, and you have to work very closely with your illustrator to determine what is good and what isn't, what needs to be there and what doesn't need to be there. I think that's, is there another question following this?
Well, if I could just cut in and talk a little bit about the process from Richard's end of it. I would like to say, if you look at the rough, it's to get a basic idea. It's like a thumbnail sketch or a storyboard for the story, and it's very quickly rendered. It just gives the basic idea, and then from that document, and you've got one of these for every single scene in the book, and you can see that it's divided into sections. So there were at least 2 or 3 illustrations per page. so at that point, you know what you need to illustrate. And Richard traveled to Saskatchewan to Brian and got a lot of documentation there as to the land and what it looked like. He also had just so many books come through the door that he would order just to understand the time period and understand the Navy and the corvettes. And he also would select individual real people to be models for the characters. And some of the characters would have as many as 3 different people for that same character, because they would change as they grew up, as they aged. So Richard has said that every picture or every page takes at least 3 days to illustrate, and that's not including all of the research. So, in
fact, the picture that was shown in the images that came up at the beginning included one of the principal persons that was depicted in the novel, who we were first introduced to on HMCS Sackville as a reenactor, a military reenactor, who wanted to wear a naval uniform. In fact, the same naval uniform that his grandfather had worn in World War II. And luckily, he was slim, as a similar build, I guess, to his grandfather, who 60 years before had worn that uniform, and he still wears it on board Sackville to this day when he comes down to greet individuals who want to talk about the ship or see the ship. Going back a little bit to how Richard became familiar with the ship, he and I worked together on a painting for the Royal Canadian Navy's 100th anniversary in 2009 and 2010. And when I realized what an excellent artist he was, I asked him shortly after that if he could do something about illustrating a book that would talk about Sackville, the loss of 269 corvettes. And he was quite keen on the idea. I know that he showed us a number of storyboards during those early years, during the teens, and it evolved into the book that he and Brian and Susan have worked on, and we're talking to you about tonight.
It started way back in 2012, right, Brian?
Oh, yes, this has been a long process. And you know, some unavoidable interruptions, but I think it's a long process regardless for any graphic novel, if it's as detailed as this one and as extensive as this one. I just thought I'd get in about the story a bit. Doug referenced Canada's buildup in the Navy. When we started the war, Canada really wasn't a naval power by any means. But we ended the war as, I think, the 3rd largest navy on the planet. And in typical Canadian fashion, we turned them into Massey Ferguson combines. This is what we do. We rise to the challenge, we do what we need to do, and then we go back to what we've always done. We don't toot our horn about it afterwards. I think it's time we did. We saved Europe. We were responsible for getting everything over there single-handedly. The Americans had their hands full in the Pacific. The British has their hands full elsewhere on the planet. And it was our responsibility to get goods and services to Europe. And we did it. It was the longest battle of the war.
Certainly the longest campaign of the war, because it was the entire war, best part of 6 years.
So this career of the Sackville is far more extensive than is covered in the book, but I chose one convoy there and back to illustrate what was typical of ships at that time, and it was a desperate thing. the Germans were technically had an advantage over us for most of the war. We were playing catch up for quite a while, and we were stretched pretty thin. Referring back to the Prairie Boys again, one of the advantages that people on the plains seemed to have was their ability to gauge distance, size, and the intersection of traversing, lines of travel, skills that were very useful in the Navy, and we gained a reputation for this somehow. But there were people who joined and served from all across the country, and my protagonist isn't exactly a boy from Winnipeg. Richard's initial protagonist was, but I thought I'd make him more representative of the entire prairie experience. So he's really from somewhere between the Rockies and Winnipeg. Okay.
And the name remains. So from Richard's.
I kept the name. Yes, I did.
Wally,
yes.
Which is Richard's father.
Who is himself a very famous person, but that's another story.
I'm wondering, Doug, if you could talk a bit about the way the ship responded to the ocean, and I think this kind of captures that.
It does. That's thank you for that, Susan. Yes, these pictures give you an idea of what it was like to serve in those ships in a heavy seaway. And the corvette was a tiny ship compared to the modern frigates that Canada operates, like HMCS Halifax, that just returned to harbor a day or two ago. Less than half the length of those frigates, and about 1/5 of the tonnage. And this little ship that you see depicted here was struggling. She's bouncing around a lot. The young sailors in particular would have been very uncomfortable and very seasick until they got their sea legs, as it was called in those days, until you became used to your ship moving around underneath you. The creature comforts were just about non-existent. One good thing was you slept in your hammock. You didn't have a bunk, you had hammocks, and the hammocks stayed stationary while the ship moved around it. And so that was some solace, that hopefully you got a decent sleep out of huddled in your bunk. And then you had to battle seasickness and one man for you and one hand for you and one hand for the ship, sort of thing, moving around the ship after you got out of your hammock and went to do whatever you were tasked to do. The last big trip I did in the Navy, we were at sea for 30 days between Halifax and Portsmouth, England. 60-foot seas and 60-knot winds for all of those 30 days. And this was in a modern, much more comfortable ship than the Corvettes. But the pictures you see here could have been just that rough. The one thing that the Corvettes had going for them was that they were splendid seaboats. You could feel safe. You weren't going, you might be torpedoed, but as long as that didn't happen, the ship would get you from point A to point B. They were excellent seaboats, as they were called.
They were also, one of the advantages they had was that they could turn inside a Mark 7 submarine, could they not?
That's true, because they were actually based on the design of a whaling ship. And a whaling ship had to be able to maneuver more quickly than a whale. In those days, these whaling ships would have a harpoon. It sounds pretty barbaric these days, but there was a lot of whaling going on many years ago. They would chase the whale and shoot it with a harpoon, and then the whale would be rendered down into various products that everybody used in those days. So the Corvettes were scaled up a bit. They were bigger than those whaling ships, but they were the same hull form, and they were very maneuverable. And as you say, Brian, they could maneuver more quickly, turning than a U-boat could submerged.
I'm wondering if we could see that next rough, and this is the rough that Richard created for the scene that follows. And if we could see that next scene, I think one of the things that I found really great about the graphic novel was the inclusion of a very strong female character. And here you see Winnie, and the discussion of her being making tanks. So that's something I wanted to bring up.
I wanted to bring it up too. It's a novel that really, it's mostly male figures in the novel, but women were instrumental to the war effort because they were doing the jobs that the men left behind. And it was a transformative period for women. It was a watershed period for women because they sort of came out from behind knitting needles and realized that, oh, I can do this too. In fact, I might be able to do it better. And I think that it's a watershed period. I wanted to get Winnie in. I wanted to make her strong. So she's a bit of a shy, retiring girl to begin with, but in that scene with the welding torch, she's anything but. And there were a lot of women that became that way during that time. So yeah, she's a very strong woman by the end of this novel. There's other elements of her character too that you'll see when you read it. I kind of like her.
Yeah. So
yes, they were. It was a very transformative time. It certainly changed society. So many men were required to go off to fight in the trenches, to fly bombers and fighters, to sail ships. And in those days, there were no women fighting, but they fought in their own way by working in industry, heavy industry, building tanks and ships and aircraft of various types. There's a very famous, the Americans used it a lot in advertising, Rosie the Riveter, who is shown riveting the fuselages of aircraft together. But they were the people who were heavily involved in providing what was needed by the men who fought the enemy forces.
Mm-hmm. It's we're seeing some images here where one of my protagonist's motives for going was the experience of his uncle who had fought during the First World War with the British. And that's part of his motivation. In this scene, the uncle is describing some of the trail of bodies that goes from one coast to the other as a result of war, and describing what's called the Battle of Jutland, which was one of the greatest conflicts of the First World War in terms of naval conflict. There were something like 200 capital ships, battleships, involved in this conflict, and of course he's referencing this and talking about it in the novel. It sort of inspires the protagonist Wally to go to war. He also tells him that the Navy will be the safest place for him because all the crew will be Newfoundlanders and Maritimers, and they are born to the sea, and he'll be right as rain, which was anything but. But I know my father was told the same thing before he left Saskatoon.
Brian, I'd like to just say that Richard used himself as the model for Uncle Garth, and I found that really interesting. And I came across a number of videos that Richard had shot of himself posing as Uncle Garth, and here is an image that he drew, and then the next image, if we could have that, was one that I created drawing him. And this was at a time when, it was about 4 months before I could bring myself to even look at any of this. I was so afraid that I wouldn't be able to actually help complete the graphic novel. So I found it really interesting that Richard was in the novel himself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in the novel too.
Yes, you are. You're the bad guy.
I'm the bad guy. Yes. The novel moves back and forth. By the way, folks, it goes from the prairie scenes and to the naval scenes, and moves back and forth episodically in a way. There is a chronology to it, but I tried to sort of link the home scenes with the Navy scenes. It's integrated as in the story for a reason. So what you're seeing here, of course, are the naval scenes, and they're dramatic. But there are a number of scenes in the novel that are really there's a Western love story in this book as well. And again, that was typical of sort of the relationships of the day. People tended to be drifting, pulled apart, and at far, different places. There were a lot of war brides came back from Europe to ranches in Canada that did not exist, things like that. But Wally is very typical, I think, of a farm boy from that time, as are other characters in the story. And pardon me, his experience at sea is typical of young men of the time. What Doug was saying about conditions aboard, I think they called it hard lying, didn't they, Doug?
Yes.
And it was
very few creature comforts.
Yeah, not many at all. So there was a lot of determination. People were sacrificing a lot, just not at risk of their lives. It was really I think that was described as the last popular war. People weren't so critical of people who took up uniforms and armed and went off to fight. It was considered the right thing to do.
War, I think, was the term, because of the certainly after the war, people became aware of all the terrible things that went on, and even more reason to honor the Allied soldiers who fought to end the war and to win the war and end it. One of the good things, I guess, we often hear about the little ships like the corvettes, was that although there would only be perhaps 80, 85 sailors on board in this little ship, they were in it together. There was a great deal of camaraderie. They made fast friends. They made friends that were lifetime friends, and were very close with their chums who were in the next hammock to them, or were bringing up hot chocolate to the upper deck to their friends and so on, who were standing watch in really unpleasant conditions. You can imagine the North Atlantic in the middle of the winter with those ships bouncing around, and everything icing up, and you had to chip the ice off the upper deck, or the ship might turn turtle. It was, as we said, hard lying, very uncomfortable, but you made wonderful friends. You depended on each other, and so you had to become friends. That was the only way to survive. These pictures are very dramatic. These two in particular are very dramatic pictures, and give you an idea of the scale of a big ship like a Liberty ship, in this case on fire, perhaps having been torpedoed, and the corvette in the foreground is on its way to try and keep the submarine down that torpedoed it. And there's a destroyer in the background. Both ships much smaller than the big merchant ships that carried the tanks and fighter planes and munitions and so on.
It was really tricky. These corvettes were barely capable of making a transit, weren't they, without refueling? There was limited fuel, limited arms, barely adequate, really. Yes,
quite true. Early in the war, what most of the corvettes did is they operated out of St. John's, Newfoundland. So they were part way across already. and they would sail across, escorting eastbound convoys to the vicinity of Londonderry in Northern Ireland. So that shortened the transit. So they would be leaving St. John's full of fuel, of course, and then they would turn, when they got close to the UK, they would turn the convoy over to a British escort group and proceed into, many of them into Londonderry, which was kind of a home away from home, particularly for the corvettes.
Yep, it was, and the danger was right up to the river into Londonderry too. My dad said that when the armistice was announced, and they were bringing convoy in to Derry, and the signal went from Dunits in Europe to surrender, surface and surrender. 3 of them popped up undetected in the middle of the convoy. You know, right there. So yeah. It's they were lucky, I think, on that one. Wolf packs, of course, were part of this scenario as well. And the tactic that the Germans used was to converge a number of submarines on a convoy and attack from various directions and confuse and, of course, create havoc with the limited number of escorting vessels. And there's an episode described in the novel that deals with that. It was pretty terrifying. The sailors that I've spoken to from that time were constantly in fear all the time. My dad said you could go to he had a bunk. He didn't sleep in a hammock. He was an officer, but he said, was it comfortable? He said, not really. There was 3/4 of an inch of steel between you and the torpedo, things like that. So that tension was constant.
Yeah. And I understand a lot of sailors, officers, and men would sleep fully clothed with a life jacket on, so that if something did happen, then they, made their way to the upper deck to fight the ship or to abandon the ship, whatever might come of that encounter.
Yep.
Susan, are these pictures that you did?
Right now, I'm not sure which picture you're looking at. I'm on someone else's computer, and it's done something, and I've lost the image that we've been reviewing. So if you could tell me which one it is.
I think we're looking at U-boat on surface L.
U-boat on surface
L.
L.
And M.
Okay.
L and M.
No, actually, this is something that Richard did, and it was just he had this facility to express these images with so much energy, and yes. His pen work was fabulous. He used a program called Clip Studio Paint, and he just was brilliant with it. His ability to describe a scene, I don't think anybody could match.
They are very dramatic and very realistic looking. And these pictures that I think everyone can see here now shows a corvette, in this case Sackville, with its ASDIC or sonar set, sending a signal through the water, underneath the water, and is picking up a U-boat, a submerged U-boat, and the sound bounced back so that the operator on the equipment in the corvette would be able to tell that that is a submarine from the sound of it, and also get an indication of how far it was away, and then attack.
And Doug, I'd like to say that both Richard and I, whenever we were working on illustrations, we would be in touch with you, and you would set us straight as far as what we had drawn incorrectly or misunderstood. And this subject was so far from anything that I had encountered that it was really great having your help.
Well, I was very happy to do it, and I was very impressed with what both of you were able to do in this book. Magnificent work.
It's
Would you like to talk to this at all, Brian? This
Pardon me?
picture?
I'm sorry?
Can you see this picture?
Oh, yes, yes. That's an actual historic scene, really. The reference, one of the main references for what I did here was a book written called North of 60, which was written by the captain of the Sackville. And he describes this scene where the submarine was depth charged and rose just like that to the surface, right behind the ship. They practically could reach out and touch it. I think it must have been terrifying for anybody aboard. But Richard captured that perfectly, I think. It's a very striking image.
I'll speak to this. This was Richard's desk and the way he left it, expecting to come back and work on these images in his binder. And the way he would decide on what image he would be working on would be, he had a little paper bag. He had each illustration, each page written on a little piece of paper, and he'd put all of these in the bag, and he would pull it out, and that would be the one he would be working on. And you do that so that when you're going through illustrations over time, that nothing jumps out as far as a change in your style as you go along. And he also had on the desk my picture from, I must have been, I don't know, 7 or 8, and his elementary school picture. So yeah, he was very, very sweet.
Yes. He was a great loss.
Okay, so now I see questions coming up. And I have a question from Alan, and he's asking me how much had Richard completed when I had to take over. I would say maybe I don't know, maybe a 5th or a 6th of the book remained. And then there was organizing and developing the chapter heads, the chapter images. And Richard was so well organized. He had all kinds of research material that he had painstakingly attached to the images. So in reality, it was great. He had all the models shot. I was able to work from them, and I first had to learn the graphic program, which was Clip Studio Paint, and that took a while. But yeah, it was a process for sure. There were some of his drawings that were partly completed. And that I had to finish. There were some where, and Brian would remember this, he had these huge, I don't know, maybe 50-gallon hats.
Oh, yeah, the cowboy hats, yeah.
And I would need to, after, with Brian's urging about what probably was more real, I had to go back and change hats on some people, and also take a lot of the trees and shrubbery out of the backgrounds of some of the images, because it just wasn't Saskatchewan.
Nope. No, it was pretty dry and barren here at that time. It still is in some ways, but we're getting better. It's the is there anything that you would like me to explain or discuss?
There's a question that's come up for you, Brian. I don't know if you can see it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can, yes. Yes, I do think it's important because any experience of war has a lesson, and certainly there's a lesson here. We need to be, I mean, it's been said 1,000 times. I'm just repeating what's been said, but I will say it because it's important. We need to remember what we've done, and remember and look at why we did it, and so that we don't have to do it again. I think that if we bury the past, as we try to do, or seem to have tried to do with First Nations concerns of today, it just comes back. It's never going to go away. And if we fight a war, whether we win or lose, there's something to learn from this. There's something to take with us and to tell the kids. You know, we've had an experience. We need to share it, and this is how I can do it. So I hope that I've achieved something with this. If we can show it, I don't want to write a Rambo novel. I want to write something that's real, and I think that, are there heroes in this book? Yes, there are. Anyone that does it for the right reason is a hero. So I hope I've explained it. I hope I've shown you in an entertaining way what it's like to make these sacrifices and to make a decision to go. One of the things that prompts Wally when he asks him in the novel, "Why are you doing this?" and he says, "It's because they're afraid. They're afraid. And it's the people at home who can't go, who can't fight. Who's going to do that for them? He has to do it, so he does." And I think that's what most people did.
There's a question here for me. Why do people still come to see Sackville? Basically, Sackville is a unique ship. She happens to be Canada's Naval Memorial. She's been Canada's Naval Memorial since May of 1985 by an order in council by the Canadian government of the day. And she is the only one of 269 corvettes that were built in the UK and in Canada, of course, and another 4 that were actually built in France, captured by the Germans and used for local escort along the French coast during World War II. They never had to meet their British or Canadian counterparts at sea. But so Sackville is unique. She's a living, breathing, if you will, example of what it was like for young men, many of whom were 17, 18, 19 years old. There were very few old people who went to sea in corvettes. Even the captains were frequently just in their late 20s. Many of them would have spent some time going to sea in merchant ships or ferries. Some of them were fishing captains and so on. But she's laid out with mess decks, which give people a very good indication of what it was like to sail in those ships, in those very cramped mess decks where you might have 30 young men sharing a very small space. They lived in that space. They ate their meals on tables in that space with the hammocks overhead and bare feet hanging out of people who were having a nap coming off their watches. It gives you a pretty good idea of what it was like to be at sea and the privations, but also the kind of camaraderie that would have been the case in those days. People living, sleeping, writing letters home, playing cards, you name it, in that confined little space when they weren't actually on watch on the bridge, hunting submarines and on Aztec sets, or keeping out of the way of the merchant ships that they were protecting. So it's a slice of history, and you have a chance to experience that. And we've had tens of thousands of people visit in the past. Every summer in particular, the ship is down at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic on the Halifax waterfront now, as she usually is each summer. And the pandemic, COVID-19, has certainly made it difficult to do that. But we're coming out of the end of that a bit, we feel. And just very recently, the ship is now open for upper deck tours, which we couldn't do at all last year. But ship is now open for upper deck tours. So people who are able to come to Halifax are certainly, and they haven't been to Sackville before or would like to see her again. She had a refit last winter and is looking splendid. She's looking better now than she did when she was brand new, I think. So anyway, do come and see her. People have really enjoyed that for many years, and I hope our viewers and listeners would like to do that in the near future.
I'll put a plug in for Sackville because I think that Sackville represents the type of vessel that would actually handle a campaign, handle the war. The capital ships, the large cruisers and so on, aircraft carriers, well, maybe not aircraft carriers, but battleships for sure. They're largely political weapons, aren't they? They're sort of like the king on the chessboard. He's there, he's a presence, he's strategist, but he's not a player really. It's the pawns that do the work.
Yes, the corvettes were definitely pawns.
So this is very representative of the type of ship that actually was in an active campaign, as opposed to, say, the USS Missouri, which is a magnificent vessel, but didn't. You know, it's some battleships never went to war. You know, it's the smaller ones are the ones that did the heavy lifting.
Yes.
Always.
I have a question here for me, whether I feel that my style and Richard's drawing styles are similar, or did I have to do a lot of work to adapt to his style, or did I stick to my own style? Well, I came as close as I could given the amount of time. I mean, maybe if I had spent 5 more years on it, I could have come closer to his style. It was more my intention that it didn't become glaringly different, and also that that the story was told accurately. So I tried my best.
Yeah. What has been the feedback? It's a bit early for feedback yet. I don't know. I'm hoping to hear though what the feedback is to my graphic novel style. I really can't say because I haven't had any comments, so I'm anticipating more as we go.
I think it's a very popular style now. I mean, graphic novels are very current, and especially with younger readers, and it's become a genuine art form in its own right.
The genre, yes, for certain. It's a very popular genre. As to style, I guess that's sort of an open question, isn't it? Is narrative style or graphic style, or how do you interpret style? I think the work dictates style in terms of how the story is told. When you start to write, it's usually the end result of a lot of research and thought. I know from my own experience when I write other things, it's the voice I use, if you want to call it that, varies a lot. And I think with Susan and artists, that's the same. You may have a kind of a technique that's sort of typical of you that can identify you, but most artists that I know have a variety of different things that they pursue. You do, and I write differently depending on the project. Yeah.
Brian, I had a question I meant to ask you earlier. You had mentioned earlier that you helped your father write his memoirs.
Yes.
Of his time in the Navy in World War II. Is there any of your father's experiences or feelings about his service that have made its way through Wally into this book?
Well, certainly, you know, his uniforms hung in the closet in my bedroom for ever and ever. So it was a constant reminder every time I opened the door there. But I've always been interested in it, and certainly his experience informed me a lot. He was pretty upfront about the living conditions aboard. Like many veterans, he didn't want to talk about action, though. So that was something I had to research elsewhere. But no, conditions of life aboard the Corvette, the camaraderie, all of those things that we mentioned earlier were part of my experience of him. And in terms of the camaraderie, they picked up some survivors from a sunken U-boat, and they were at sea for about 2 weeks with them. And of course, they were bunking in with the rest of the crew. Some of them formed friendships that lasted for decades after the war. You know, they weren't all Nazis in those U-boats, and they were fighting and they were serving for the same reason we were. But yes, there was I think that sort of confinement, that sort of hardship. You're a sailor, whether you're wearing one uniform or another, and they formed lasting friendships. You know, it's kind of poignant to me that we have to have a war to discover something like that about people in another country. You know?
Yeah, people are people, and sailors are sailors.
Yeah.
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 Would there be any more questions?
Questions? Yeah.
Any?
Maybe Brian, you could explain why the title "Dusty Dreams in Troubled Waters." What?
Well, Dusty Dreams. Most of the dreams out here, people started out with great hopes. A lot of people came out and got a quarter section of land and proved it up and expected that they would make something of it and make something of themselves and their families. And it all went to ashes in the 1930s for a number of reasons, many of which were to do with farming practices. So the dusty dreams is the dreams that have turned to dust. Troubled waters, of course, refers to the action at sea and the conflict there. So it is a pairing.
There is a question here from Christine Hemming. I came in late, but I recall Susan saying to me once that Richard researched a lot to get the details of the time exact as possible.
He was quite a reader and very intent on getting everything right, and you know, right down to insignia and, you know, buttons on the jackets. And he was watching old movies and of course consulting with you, Doug. And he, you know, we've got a small library of reference books that he collected, just sending away. There would be another book in the mailbox, and he was very thorough.
It's a part of the process. I read too. I read a lot. I went online. I went to every veterans site I could find with anything to do with that story. The more you know, the more comfortable you are about trying to write the narrative. And so it doesn't surprise me that Richard did that. I actually respect people who do that. It's I want to see kids. I want to think of a kid under a blanket with a flashlight looking at that novel. And you know, in order to achieve that, you have to do a lot of work. You have to make it real. And that's what he was trying to do. I'm positive of it. He was trying to make it real. He was intent on it. He's a professional.
Are there any more questions? Any more questions from those tuning in from home?
Looks like we've said it all.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for tuning in. If you haven't bought the book yet, I'm sure you will enjoy it. The illustrations are amazing, from Richard Rudnicki and from Susan, and I think that Brian Bowman has done a terrific job in adding text that's very appropriate.
And
I certainly
you
have
keeping
enjoyed
us straight.
Yeah.